Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/295, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109, and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 295th edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name is Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. On this edition, we're going to be talking about making your tent stealthier. And we're going to get to that in a second here, but of course, we've got a little bit of housekeeping here. By the time you are listening to this, we have very likely surpassed 1 million downloads of the Pedalshift Project, and we are going to have a little bit of a celebration on all of that. It's going to be Pedalshift Live, Sunday, September 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, celebrating 1 million downloads of the show. I've got a few people who have emailed me. I would love to hear from more of you. Email me and tell me what the show has meant to you so I can share that along with folks. I also have a line on some special guests, which means that the technical elements of the show could be a complete disaster as I try something new. However, if it works, it's going to be amazing because special guests are always fun. Also, we're going to be doing the official announcement of my next tour, which is going to be coming up later this month. This episode, of course, it has some elements that will, I don't know if they'll give you a hint, but they'll at least speak to some of the elements of that tour. But the official announcement will be made Sunday, September 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And that will be pedalshift.net/live, or check it out on the YouTube channel. If you are not a subscriber, if you subscribe and hit the bell, it will notify you when I am going live, which will be Sunday, September 11th at 8 p.m. I hope I get as many of you who can make it as possible. I know we're kind of time zone challenged with some folks around the world, but if you can make it, I would love to have you be a part of it. I think it should be a lot of fun. If you can't, it will, of course, be the next episode. It'll be episode 296 of the Pedalshift Project, so you get to at least celebrate time shifted. Yes, that's what the kids call it these days. All right, so I really do hope to see you. Look for some emails if you are subscribed to the newsletter that does not exist because I'm too lazy to be able to put out a newsletter. Trust me, it's still there. I still see when you subscribe, everyone. I will someday write again. It's just lots of reasons, but in any event, you'll be getting an email about all of this as well. On this edition, we are going to be talking about making your tent stealthier because, after all, as I've talked about on the show, stealth camping is a great skill to develop and a fantastic option to have in your back pocket in case there are emergencies, or maybe for many of you, it might be your main overnight plan on a bike tour. But what if your tent is so bright it can be seen from literally miles away? I kind of had that. On this episode, we're going to talk about what worked for my last tent and what I'm trying on my newer one. One thing that I do want to get into, talking about stealth camping, it's hard to ignore what's been going on in kind of the stealth camping community. I wanted to send my condolences out to Steve Wallis, who many of you know from his incredible stealth camping YouTube channel called Camping with Steve. About a week or so ago from when I'm sitting here recording, he posted a video and it was just a real shocker seeing his wife suddenly and really shockingly died in her sleep. I've learned a ton from Steve's channel. I know many of you have as well. I have to be honest, this hit me pretty hard. I hope he's finding peace and healing in these really hard times. And I really don't have much more to say other than that. And I just hope that things get better. I just hope that things get better for him. And if you've never checked out Steve's channel, I really would recommend doing that. He's got a kind of a fun vibe to him. If you like what I do here, you'll definitely dig what he's doing over there. Of course, he's going to be quiet for quite a while for all the reasons. All right, awkward transition, but let's go back into what I wanted to talk about today, and that is dealing with a tent that's maybe not so stealthy. So let's start off by talking about, and this is a review for many of you who have been with the show for more than a minute, my previous tent is an ALPS Mountaineering Zephyr 2, and it was bright orange, and oh boy was it orange. Now, that was a feature, not a bug for me at the time. It is a tremendous tent. I think a great value, relatively lightweight. It is a kind of a backpacking kind of tent, but more of a bargain priced one. You can get them on Amazon. I think you can probably get them from their website and whatnot. I've really enjoyed using the ALPS Mountaineering tent. And so that tent has served me well for many, many, many years. And then I was starting to get into the concept of getting into stealth camping. And when you have a bright orange tent and panniers and, well, you know how I roll, you need to figure out something new. And part of what I thought about doing was to get a totally different tent. But I wasn't sure how into stealth camping I was going to be doing. So I started off actually by getting a dark green hammock. And that's when I sort of got into stealth camping on the hammock side of things, then decided that hammock as a primary type of camping wasn't for me. So I reverted back to the ALPS Mountaineering Zephyr 2 tent. And I thought, okay, well, surely they must make replacement tarps for them. Well, they don't. And then I thought, okay, well, surely there are replacement tarps for all sorts of different types of tents, and maybe no, it's not designed for that, but there must be kind of standard tarps for these types of tents. And I did not find that to be the case. So then I thought about, okay, well, what if I just get, a regular old inexpensive brown or green tarp and put it over the top of that? And I played around with that a little bit, and it was just, it wasn't great. And especially if there's any kind of wind that you have going on, you'd have to stake it down. That's certainly an option, but it wasn't good enough for me. What I really wanted was I wanted my tent with a tarp that was of a suitable cover. And so what I decided to do was, you know what, this tent is towards the end of its useful life anyways. Why don't I try something crazy? And I decided to spray paint it because I couldn't come up with a better idea. So I bought a few cans of matte forest green spray paint and very dark green. And I think did I buy 1 or 2 cans of it? I think I bought 2 cans. Thinking, oh, this is way more than I need. And as it turned out, I needed a 3rd can. So I'd actually get a 3rd can of it to get that final bit of coverage there. So a lot more paint than I really anticipated. And part of that was because I really needed to fully cover the tent tarp because the orange would just kind of stick right out. And that, of course, defeats the entire purpose. So more paint was required than I expected. I then finished it off with, I believe it was the KIWI brand of waterproofing spray. This is the kind of stuff that you can use to waterproof things that are nylon, but not necessarily waterproof. They're typically used for boots and for tarps. I believe I needed 1 large can of that to give it a full coating on top. And what was I left with? Well, many of you have seen it. It looks great. Worked like a charm. It was the perfect color for stealth camping on that Cincinnati or DC to Cincinnati tour when I kind of had not an emergency situation, but I don't feel like cycling anymore and there are no other real options. I kind of stealth camped on the edge of a town park and in between there and a cemetery and a high school. It was kind of like this weird area. And it worked great. I was very well hidden. The coloring worked really well. Turned out there were going to be thunderstorms that night. The waterproofing worked tremendously. Of course, I camped in that tent many, many times after that, and the waterproofing did just great. Water beaded right off of it. The downside to it was, first of all, especially in the early days and weeks and months with it, it still had a little bit of a smell to it. That was a lot of spray paint. Also, just the environmental aspects of using that much spray paint, frankly, I wasn't super into that, but, kind of it was what it was. And that was the only real method I could think of to really put it on there. I'm sure there are other ways. But yeah, so there was that. So there was the smell. Then, of course, also the weight and the stiffness. The tarp definitely didn't kind of ball up as easily. It also had a perceptible additional weight to it. And when I say weight, it wasn't like it weighed more, but it had more thickness to it, for lack of a better way of putting it. And that kind of makes sense. There was a layer, I'll say thin, but relatively thick layer when all is said and done of paint that was on top of it. The other downside to the painting method was the tarp before was reasonably translucent, so more light came through it. After the paint job, it was not. It was much closer to opaque than translucent. So that meant that things were darker during sunlit hours. Now, in some ways, that could be considered a feature, not a bug, but I found that that bothered me a little bit more than I expected to. So what ended up happening with it? Well, it served me well for years and years. I think at least another 3 seasons, if memory serves. What ended up happening is, as I mentioned before, this was a tent that had been used for a long time, and it was sort of entering the end of its usefulness. And what I discovered, was it last season? Maybe 2 seasons ago, that the tent zippers started to fail. And what that meant was that I couldn't fully zip the doors shut. The zippers would come detached. They would strip along the zipper. And I am sure if I was handy, if I was smart, if I was good with a sewing machine or something like that, I could potentially find replacement zippers for it. That just struck me as way too much work. And of course, I don't have a sewing machine or anything along those lines. So just the cost to acquire the things to fix this ended up causing me to decide to move on from it. We'll get to that in a moment. The other thing that I'll mention is that the color has worn off slowly over time. I wouldn't say that it flaked off, but every time it gets balled up, crease lines show in the darker green. And what you do see coming through it is, of course, the original orange. Now, it's still very, very, very stealthy in its current form. But yeah, you can see a little bit of that orange kind of stick through. I do think that actually what it's done is it breaks up the color a little bit. So I do think that it might, it certainly still serves its purpose as a camouflaging tarp, but because of the zippers, because of the issues involved with all of that, of course, it's just not as useful. Would not be great in a storm, would not be great for any of the uses that you really need a tarp for. So I had to move on, and I decided to buy a brand new tent, and my brand new tent was an ALPS Mountaineering Zephyr 2 again, because I found it to be a great value. It lasted forever, and I really grew used to the footprint. I also, speaking of footprint, was able to keep the same footprint that I had before, so I didn't have to buy a new one. So there were some cost savings in all of that. Now, one thing that I'll say is, when you buy something that you liked years ago and then go with the same thing years later, sometimes the manufacturing changes, sometimes the design changes, and often you can be a little bit disappointed in that. And I knew that that was potentially an issue. Sometimes when you get into larger mass production, your original really great product doesn't necessarily keep up with the times. I will say that for the most part, I've been fairly pleased with the new version of the Zephyr 2. It did come in a different color. It's now blue with a very light gray tarp. If memory serves, they still made the original orange, but my idea was, look, I'm going to have to do something to make this tent stealthy no matter what. I think that it'll be easier to deal with a different color than orange. So for the first time ever, I didn't buy something in orange. I will say that it's certainly better than orange, but it still desperately needs some stealthification for that particular tarp. So my idea was, and since I wasn't going to be doing any kind of stealth camping over the last couple of years through COVID, I haven't done a thing to it. I've stayed mostly in places where they are established campsites. I've just haven't really had to think too much about stealth camping other than sort of my stealth camping scouting, which I think I've done a few episodes on here. I haven't done any actual stealth camping for a while. Using this particular tent, I think I've used the other tarp before for it, and we'll get to that in a little bit. When I was doing some research on a variety of different things, I was, living in Reddit as I often am, and I noticed that somebody had suggested for this very issue to use some RIT dye to dye the color of the tent, of the tarp, so that it would be more stealthy. And I thought about that for a second, and I was like, I'm just not sure if that would work. But the person was very, it seemed like that they were suggesting that they had done it before. So I went and looked for the dyes that could do the job. Now, RIT is a brand, and it's RIT, a brand of dye here in the States that it's sort of like Kleenex. It's like the brand for dyeing, although I'm sure there are other dye brands out there. This seems to be the most ubiquitous one. I bought 3 different applications of it. I bought 2 dark green general dyes, and I bought one that was specifically meant to be used for nylon, which I thought was going to be the thing to get me over the top, knowing that different fabrics take dyes in different ways. I was a bit skeptical, to be perfectly honest. And the number one thing that I would say that fed my skepticism was, and why I didn't try this before, was this thing's waterproof, like by design. It's going to resist all sorts of liquids getting on it. So I was really skeptical that the dye would get in there. But, it sounded like that somebody else had had some success with this. So I thought, this is not a very expensive route. Let me give it a shot. I know the spray painting works, but there were some downsides to it. Let's go full on lab style. The older segments of the show where we used to do the lab, where we did experiments. Let's do a big experiment. All right, so the idea here was that the chocolate brown dye, because they did not make the nylon specialty dye in forest green, got added in there, and the 2 dark forest greens. And what you end up doing is you bring a big pot of water to boil. Now, when you're doing this much dyeing, it takes a lot. Each of those bottles does 3 gallons of water. So I put 9 gallons of water in a gigantic crab pot that I have out here at the cabin. And I had one of those big plastic bins. I guess, are those 50 gallons? No, those can't be 50 gallons. Those are probably 25 gallons. And I put the tarp in the bin. I got the dye really going. The directions for it required some dish soap that you put in there as well, and suggested, at least for the chocolate brown, that you have to keep it up at about 200 degrees, which would have been meant at the stovetop. I didn't have anything nearly big enough to be able to pull that off. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be deviating from the directions no matter what. Let's just get this nice and hot. Let's get all the dyes in there together. Let's get it mixed up properly. And then let's mix it up and then keep swishing around that tarp within the ginormous amount of dye while trying not to get it on me. And so I did that. It actually retained its heat for quite a long time. I moved it outside. We had a good solid 90-degree day. So that did manage to keep the heat on it for a while. And I just let it go overnight. I would say it probably wasn't quite 24 hours, but it was probably a solid 18 of really sitting in there. The interesting thing is the directions suggested that you don't get much more after about an hour on the heat. So I thought, well, let's just give it a shot. You never know. And at first, I would say it seemed like it took better than I anticipated. It looked like that the side, the waterproof side, the front side, the outside of the tarp did take on a fair amount of green, forest green dye. And that, but the real killer was on the reverse side. The underside of the tarp went from a very, very light gray, like almost white, to a dark shade of brown, which I thought was pretty fantastic and went beyond what my expectation was. But by the time you take it out of there, and you really give it a good rinse off, and you give it a really good dry, and then you fix the dye by putting it into a dryer for a little bit of a time. Here's what I ended up with, and you can check it out on the show notes. I've got a series of pictures which I think can kind of demonstrate the whole process for you. Is the underside of the tarp remains a very nice chocolate brown, a medium brown, which I think is actually, from a stealth perspective, actually not bad. It's not going to work in all scenarios, probably more for deeper into a fall than being able to be terribly stealthy in a real green canopied forest, but very useful, I think. But on the working side, the outside, it did nothing. I think that the green that I saw before was basically just the fact that it was wet with a little bit of dye on it. And that, of course, all rinsed off. And when it was rinsed and dried, literally no difference in color. I think any difference in color that I saw is probably because the darker brown on the underside creates a little bit of difference in the translucence of the entire tarp. So generally speaking, I would say this. Dyeing your tarp is unlikely to make much of a difference for the way the tarp was intended. The waterproofness of the tarp itself is just going to repel the dye. You're not going to get a lot out of it, except for the underside. And so that brings us to kind of the interesting space where I'm at right now. What am I going to do? I've got a trip coming up. And again, I'll reveal this on September 11th. And of course, also, it's going to be actually the next episode of this particular show. But I've got one tarp that is forest green that's not particularly suitable for heavy rain. I've got this newer tarp that is very light gray, but perfect for rain in its standard form. And the reverse side of it is dark brown and not suitable for anything but dry weather. And not to reveal what's going to be happening for this particular tour, but I am going to be needing to do some stealth camping for at least a few nights of my upcoming tour. And we'll talk more about the specifics of that in the next episode of the live show, pedalshift.net/live, September 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Another plug for that. So what the heck am I going to do for this upcoming tour here? Well, as it turns out, I've decided that I'm going to bring both of the tarps with me for the next tour. When I've done stealth camping before, I have frequently brought along with me just a standard brown tarp on one side, green on the other side. You know, the typical kind of nylon tarp with the grommets that you can buy at a Walmart or anything like that. And they're fine. They make a crap ton of noise. And I've always been a little, I don't want to say that I haven't liked carrying them, but I don't find them to be particularly stealthy. The green is like a Kelly green, which frankly you can see really easily. So the green's not very helpful. And the brown was, I thought, useful, but the noisiness of that tarp was just, I thought, a little too much. Now all of a sudden I'm realizing, wait a second, if I've got two tent flies, that might be useful to replace that there. So I'm going to bring both with me. I believe that the two color options that I have are going to be really useful for me. The brown tarp might be useful in some circumstances. I know the green tarp has been really useful in other circumstances, depending on where I'm tucked in. What is the nature of the coverage that I've got? So having two different color choices, I think, is going to be a really helpful thing. I also, however, need to know that I've got a good rain option. I can't just bring the green tarp with me, the older rain fly with me, because that does not properly zip up. And if it doesn't properly zip up, then one whole side of my tent is exposed to wetness. And so if I get caught in a good sized thunderstorm, which is always potentially possible in the place where I'm going to be going, no, I'm not going to tell you where it is yet. I've got to have a replacement for that. I also know that I don't always need to be stealth on virtually any tour I've gone on. I've never gone on a pure stealth camping tour. It might be something for consideration next year or in a future year. But this upcoming tour, and frankly, most of my tours, I don't need to be stealth every single night. So where does that leave me with the options when I bring both of these tarps with me? So the first thing that I would say is that it's good efficiency from options ahead of me. If I have no need for stealth, which I know is the case for at least a few nights for my upcoming tour, and indeed any kind of tour like on the C&O or whatever, where I'm going to be in campgrounds where I'm allowed to be in, I'm going to use the new tarp, the newer tarp, the functional tarp, in its normal position regardless of weather. So if I'm someplace where it's a campground that it's allowed, I'm allowed to be out there open and notorious, as we say in the law, then it's fine. My light gray outer shell will be just fine, and I don't have to worry about it. The rain will come down on it. If it's raining, if it's not raining, it's fine too. So use the new tarp if I don't have to worry about stealth. Next up, there are two other scenarios that I have to worry about, both of which are when I'm stealth camping. If I'm stealth camping and it's dry, I look at the weather, there's no chance of rain that particular night or snow or whatever, I can use the green tarp, the older version, for the tent, and the flipped around version, the brown side out of the newer rainfly, to cover the bike. Or maybe vice versa. It's going to depend on the nature of where I am at. But the beauty of these two things together is that I will be able to be comfortable knowing that I'll be covered in whichever color makes sense. And my bike will also be covered up, because don't ever forget that when you're doing stealth camping, your bike is full of reflecty things. And even if you've got it lying down kind of in the ground cover, it's still entirely possible that a stray headlight or a stray flashlight could catch something that's reflecting, and then boom, you're discovered. So I like the ability to cover up. That's what the old system was when I had the kind of like nylon tarp that made all the noise and everything. And now I won't be making all of that noise when I'm putting it up. I tend to pick stealth camping spots where I can make a little bit of noise and it's no big deal. But the lower your impact is, the better overall. And I think by having both of these rain flies with me, and to be able to cover up use one of them to cover up my bike will be a far superior situation compared to what I had. And I'll choose which tarp on a non-rain night, which is best for the conditions that I've got around me. The tent will sit higher up. It will be above ground cover. So if green is better, I'll put the older tent fly on. If brown is better, I'll put that one on. And when I say brown, of course, that's just inside out. It'll be, and that's why this only works when it's dry. Okay, that's great. That seems like the majority of the stealth camping nights would be in those conditions. And it's a hit as far as I'm concerned. What happens if it rains? Okay, so if I need stealth and it's rain, the first thing I'm going to say is that if it's going to be raining, the likelihood of discovery is much lower, because when it's raining out, fewer people are going to be out and about. Of course, that's going to depend on where you're at, all the conditions and things like that. But I think that from the beginning, stealth camping in the rain, I think, is safer, quote unquote, from discovery. So that's the first thing. But I still need to make sure that my shelter is functional. So that means that I've got to use the proper side out, the newer rain fly, clicked in the right position for the tent. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the old rain fly and essentially just lash it down on top. So that will give me my camouflage, and then the waterproofness will be below it using the newer rain fly. So I think that you get the best of both worlds there. Now, the downside, of course, is the bike is going to be exposed. But again, because it's raining, because I think that there would be lesser chance of discovery potentially, I will sacrifice the fact that the bike will be out. I'll find other ways to cover up any of the reflective surfaces as I can, and go with that. A lot of people ask me when I do stealth camping, wait a second, don't you have orange panniers with reflectors on them? Yes, and those come inside with me. In fact, I almost always bring my panniers inside my tent with me out of habit. They do have some functionality for me when they're inside of the tent as well. If they were wet, if they're muddy or dirty or whatever, maybe they go in the vestibule instead. But for the most part, they come in with me. So ultimately, when I'm in a stealth camping situation, I am going to have just neutral colors. And in the way that I've kind of just laid this all out for you, I'm either going to have a brown tent or I'm going to have a green tent, depending on the weather conditions and what's going on there. So that's what I'm going to do. And that's going to be part of a larger experiment. That's going to be part of the next tour. And of course, we'll be sharing all of that in the tour journals that'll be coming up throughout the rest of the fall into the end of the year. So some takeaways for you. If you're looking to make your tent a little bit stealthier, folks, number one, your best bet is to get a tent with a stealthy tarp. They are weirdly hard to come by. I really like this tent so much that I stopped looking for tents that had adequate stealthiness to them. I was not finding them. And if you've got a brand that you recommend, please let us know here on the show, because I would love to be able to recommend a stealth camping first tent with a proper stealth camping color to it. Number two on the takeaways, dyeing your tent rainfly, it's just not recommended. I think that anything that's water repellent is not going to take your dye. So I would say it's a big no to that, except for the fact that the underside of my tarp did actually end up getting dyed. And there's some usefulness in that I may end up changing course and saying dyeing is recommended for your non-water repellent surfaces. We'll see. We'll have to see how that ends up going. Last but not least, the original experiment, spray painting, I think it's effective. I think it works really well. It does have some flaws. I think that you're going to want to be careful. Some paints may end up interacting with the nylon in your tent differently. So be careful with it. Experiment with a small bit of the surface. Know that you're definitely ruining any warranties you might have on your tent. But it did work out for me with some downsides, with some flaws. But for the most part, has ended up working out. And even though my rainfly has effectively gone through an end-of-life cycle with it, I'm still able to use it for some camouflage potentially with my new system. So those are my takeaways. I hope that you are having good luck with your stealth camping, and I hope that this is useful for you if you're considering making your tent stealthier. And we've got some great application of this in some upcoming episodes to come. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadas, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Bettinati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Sarus Faravar, and thanks also to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.